Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Medieval castles were designed with a single brutal principle in mind: to make entering them as deadly as possible for any uninvited guest. Every stone was placed, every passage carved, and every room constructed with the express purpose of channeling attackers into carefully orchestrated traps where they would meet their doom. But the truly horrifying reality is that these death traps didn't just claim the lives of enemy soldiers. They were equally lethal to the very people who called them home. The medieval world was a place where death lurked around every corner, and nowhere was this more apparent than within the supposedly safe walls of a castle. From the moment you crossed the threshold, you entered a realm where a single misstep could send you plummeting to your death, where disease festered in the damp corridors, and where the very air you breathed could carry the seeds of your destruction. Over the next several episodes, we'll explore the 12 most deadly aspects of medieval castle life. We'll discover how the grand entrance halls were designed as elaborate killing fields, how the spiral staircases became death traps for both defenders and attackers, and how the primitive sanitation systems turned these mighty fortresses into breeding grounds for the deadliest diseases known to mankind. But before we delve into the specific mechanisms of death that plagued these stone fortresses, we need to understand the world that created them. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was an era defined by almost constant warfare, political instability, and technological limitations that made everyday survival a monumental challenge. In this violent world, castles emerged as the ultimate expression of military architecture. They were not built for comfort or convenience. They were built to kill. Every architectural feature, from the placement of windows to the width of doorways, was calculated to maximize the defensive advantage while creating as many opportunities as possible to eliminate intruders. The first thing that strikes you about approaching a medieval castle is the deliberate intimidation factor built into its very appearance. These structures were designed to project power and inspire fear even from a distance. The massive walls, often 20 feet thick or more, weren't just defensive barriers. They were psychological weapons designed to demoralize attackers before they even reached the gates. Take Caerphilly Castle in Wales, for example. Built in the 13th century, this fortress covers over 30 acres and is surrounded by an elaborate system of water defences. The castle appears to rise directly from the lake itself, creating an almost supernatural impression of impregnable strength. This visual impact was entirely intentional. Medieval architects understood that the fear generated by their castle's appearance was often their first and most effective line of defense. But the psychological warfare began long before you reached the castle walls. The approach to any well-designed medieval fortress was a carefully choreographed journey through increasingly dangerous terrain. Roads leading to castles were deliberately constructed to force visitors into vulnerable positions, winding through marshes, along narrow causeways, or up steep hillsides where defenders could rain down death from above. The outer defences of a castle were designed as a series of concentric death traps, each more sophisticated than the last. Beyond the main walls lay the outer ward, a deceptively open space that was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Here, attackers would find themselves trapped between the outer palisade and the main castle walls, exposed to crossfire from multiple directions with no cover and no escape route. Medieval engineers were masters of what we might now call psychological manipulation through architecture. They understood that fear and confusion were their greatest allies in defending a castle. The layout of these fortresses was deliberately maze-like, designed to disorient and separate attacking forces while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. Consider the entrance to a typical 13th century castle. You might think that the main gate would be the most heavily fortified point, and you'd be correct, but not in the way you might expect. The gatehouse wasn't just a barrier to keep people out. It was an elaborate trap designed to capture and methodically eliminate anyone who managed to breach the outer defences. The standard castle gatehouse was actually a complex multi-story structure that could house dozens of defenders. These weren't simple doorways with heavy doors. They were sophisticated military installations equipped with multiple layers of defensive systems. A typical gatehouse might feature a drawbridge over a water-filled moat, followed by a portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped to trap attackers. Then another drawbridge over a dry moat or pit, followed by massive wooden doors reinforced with iron, and finally, another portcullis. But the real genius of castle defense lay not just in these obvious barriers, but in the killing zones created between them. Imagine you're part of an attacking force that has somehow managed to lower the first drawbridge and raise the first portcullis. You rush forward into what appears to be the entrance passage, only to find yourself trapped in a narrow corridor, with walls rising 30 feet on either side. Above you, defenders peer down through murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which they can drop boiling oil, molten lead, or simply large stones onto your head. The term murder hole isn't some dramatic modern invention. It's actually a translation of the medieval French meurtrière, which literally means place of murder. These openings were strategically positioned throughout castle gatehouses and corridors, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it virtually impossible for attackers to advance without suffering catastrophic casualties. Medieval castle designers had studied the art of killing with the same dedication that modern engineers study aerodynamics or structural integrity. They understood that the key to effective defense wasn't just building thick walls. It was creating situations where attackers would be forced into positions where they could be eliminated systematically and efficiently. The barbican, an outer gatehouse structure that became common in the 13th and 14th centuries, represents perhaps the pinnacle of this philosophy. A barbican was essentially a fortified funnel that forced attackers to approach the main gate along a predetermined path while being subjected to constant fire from multiple directions. The walls of a barbican were built at angles that eliminated any possibility of finding cover, while the narrow passages ensured that attacking forces would be compressed into dense formations that made them perfect targets for medieval artillery. One of the most sophisticated examples of barbican design can be found at Warwick Castle, where the approach to the main gate forces attackers to make a series of turns while being overlooked by no fewer than 6 separate defensive positions. Each turn in the path was designed to present attackers with a new threat while preventing them from seeing what lay ahead. This wasn't just military architecture, it was psychological warfare expressed in stone and mortar. The designers of these fortresses understood that an enemy's imagination could be just as effective a weapon as any sword or crossbow. By creating approaches that were clearly dangerous but whose specific threats remained hidden, they forced attackers to confront not just physical obstacles, but the constant fear of unknown perils waiting around each corner. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the medieval castle design was how these death traps affected the people who actually lived within the walls. While much attention has been paid to how castles defended against external threats, the daily reality of life inside these fortresses was often just as deadly as any siege. The same architectural features that made castles effective military installations also made them incredibly dangerous places to live. The narrow, winding staircases that confused attackers also made it easy for residents to take fatal falls, especially in the dark corridors lit only by flickering torches. The thick walls that provided protection from enemy artillery also created a damp, poorly ventilated environment that was perfect for the spread of disease. Medieval record-keeping, while not always comprehensive, provides us with glimpses of just how deadly castle life could be for its inhabitants. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with accounts of nobles and servants who met their deaths through accidents that were directly related to the defensive features of their homes. Take the tragic case of William de Braose, a powerful Norman lord who fell to his death from the walls of his own castle in 1230. According to contemporary accounts, William was inspecting the defences of Bramber Castle in Sussex when he slipped on the narrow wall walk and plummeted 40 feet to the courtyard below. The same battlement that had been designed to provide a secure firing position for archers became a death trap for the castle's own lord. Such accidents were far from rare. The defensive architecture that made castles formidable military installations also created countless opportunities for fatal mishaps. Spiral staircases, designed to favour right-handed defenders fighting their way down, were treacherous for anyone carrying loads or moving quickly in poor light. The narrow arrow loops that provided protected firing positions also created dangerous protrusions that could catch clothing or cause people to lose their balance. Perhaps most deadly of all were the castle's sanitation systems, or rather, the lack thereof. Medieval castles were essentially self-contained cities that might house hundreds or even thousands of people during times of siege. The waste produced by this population had to go somewhere, and the solutions devised by medieval engineers, while ingenious for their time, created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly diseases. The typical castle latrine, known as a garderobe, was built into the thickness of the castle walls and discharged directly into the moat or onto the ground outside the walls. While this system had the advantage of being simple and requiring no maintenance, it also meant that the castle's water supply was constantly being contaminated by human waste. During sieges, when the castle population swelled and water sources became limited, these conditions became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, found perfect conditions for transmission within castle walls. The crowded, poorly ventilated conditions, combined with primitive sanitation and the presence of rats and fleas, meant that once plague entered a castle, it could spread through the entire population within days. Contemporary accounts describe entire castle garrisons being wiped out not by enemy action, but by disease. The Chronicle of Moe Abbey records that in 1349, the great castle of Skipton was left with but 3 men alive, all others having perished of the pestilence. Similar accounts can be found throughout medieval Europe, testament to how the very features that made castles militarily effective also made them perfect environments for epidemic disease. The irony of medieval castle design becomes even more apparent when we consider how these fortresses affected the mental health of their inhabitants. The same isolation that provided security from external threats also created conditions of psychological stress that could be just as deadly as any physical danger. Medieval castles were designed to be self-sufficient during extended sieges, which meant that their inhabitants often lived in virtual isolation for months or even years at a time. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept residents in, creating an environment that modern psychologists would recognize as profoundly unhealthy. The limited natural light that filtered through the narrow arrow slits, combined with the constant dampness and poor air circulation, created conditions that we now know contribute to depression and other mental health disorders. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of castle residents who suffered from what they called melancholia, a condition that often led to suicide or other self-destructive behaviours. The case of Isabella de Fortibus, Countess of Devon and Lady of the Isle of Wight, provides a particularly poignant example of how castle life could affect mental health. After inheriting several castles following her husband's death in 1262, Isabella became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving her fortress of Carisbrooke Castle. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming much given to strange fancies and dark moods, and she eventually died alone in her castle in 1293, having lived the last 30 years of her life in virtual isolation. But the psychological toll of castle life wasn't limited to the nobility. Servants, guards, and other castle residents also suffered from the effects of living in what were essentially stone prisons. The constant threat of violence, combined with the claustrophobic conditions and social isolation, created an environment where mental breakdown was not uncommon. Medieval records speak of castle servants who suffered from what they called castle fever, a condition characterized by violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, and sometimes suicide. Modern historians have suggested that this may have been an early description of what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder or severe depression brought on by the conditions of castle life. The defensive features of medieval castles also created unique forms of accidental death that were specific to these environments. The concentric design of many castles, with multiple walls and courtyards, created numerous opportunities for people to fall from great heights. The wall walks that connected different sections of the castle were often narrow and lacked proper railings, making them particularly dangerous during bad weather or at night. One particularly deadly feature of many castles was the Great Hall's Gallery, a raised platform that allowed important guests to observe festivities below. These galleries were often built with minimal safety features, and medieval chronicles record numerous instances of people falling to their deaths during feasts and celebrations. The case of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, illustrates how even the most powerful nobles were not immune to the dangers of castle architecture. In 1398, Mortimer fell to his death from the gallery of his own great hall at Wigmore Castle, while attempting to get a better view of a tournament taking place in the courtyard below. The very feature designed to display his power and status became the instrument of his death. Perhaps most insidiously, the water systems of medieval castles created ongoing health hazards that affected every resident. Castles required enormous amounts of water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and firefighting, but the sources of this water were often contaminated by the castle's own waste systems. Many castles drew their water from wells that had been dug within the castle walls for security reasons. However, these wells were often located dangerously close to the castle's waste disposal systems, creating a constant risk of contamination. The same moats that provided defensive advantages also became stagnant pools of disease-carrying water that could poison anyone who came into contact with them. The castle of Caerphilly, mentioned earlier for its impressive water defenses, provides a perfect example of how defensive water features could become health hazards. The elaborate system of lakes and channels that made the castle nearly impossible to attack also created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Medieval records show that the castle's garrison suffered from regular outbreaks of marsh fever, almost certainly malaria transmitted by mosquitoes breeding in the stagnant water. As we've seen, medieval castles were indeed death traps, but not always in the ways their builders intended. While these fortresses were certainly effective at keeping enemies out, they were equally effective at trapping their own inhabitants in environments that were hostile to human health and safety. The thick walls, narrow passages, and defensive features that made castles militarily formidable also made them perfect environments for accidents, disease, and psychological breakdown. The very isolation that provided security also created conditions of stress and deprivation that could be just as deadly as any enemy sword. In our exploration of why medieval castles were death traps, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the dangers that lurked within these stone fortresses. The entrance halls and outer defenses we've examined today were just the beginning of a castle's deadly features. The spiral staircases that wound through castle towers, the great halls where nobles feasted and plotted, the kitchens where massive fires created constant hazards, and the dungeons where prisoners faced unimaginable horrors. Each of these spaces presented unique and deadly challenges to anyone who entered them. The medieval world was a dangerous place, and the castles that dominated its landscape were perfect reflections of that danger. Built in an age when violence was commonplace and human life was cheap, these fortresses prioritized military effectiveness over human comfort or safety. The result was a form of architecture that was as deadly to its inhabitants as it was to its enemies. As we continue our journey through the deadly secrets of medieval castles, we'll discover that these stone fortresses were not just military installations or noble residences. They were complex machines designed to control, intimidate, and when necessary, kill. Every stone was placed with purpose, every passage designed with deadly intent, and every room constructed to serve the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The next time you visit a medieval castle and admire its impressive architecture, remember that you're looking at one of history's most sophisticated instruments of death. Behind every beautiful arch and imposing tower lies a dark history of violence, disease, and accidental death that claimed countless lives over the centuries. These fortresses stood guard over the medieval world. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue part 2 of Why Medieval Castles Were Death Traps with the engaging narrative style established in your work. Here's the continuation. But the architectural nightmares of medieval castles extended far beyond their defensive features. The very materials used in their construction harbored their own deadly secrets. The mortar binding those massive stone blocks together was often mixed with whatever materials were readily available. Lime, sand, and water formed the basic recipe, but desperate builders frequently added organic matter like animal hair, blood, or even human waste to strengthen the mixture. Over time, this organic material would decay, creating pockets of weakness that could cause entire sections of wall to crumble without warning. The stones themselves told their own grim tale. Quarried from local sources, they were often of inconsistent quality. Some were porous and absorbed moisture like sponges, expanding and contracting with the seasons until they cracked and split. Others contained iron deposits that would rust over time, staining the walls with streaks of red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When these iron-rich stones finally gave way, they could send cascades of razor-sharp fragments raining down on anyone unlucky enough to be below. The wooden elements within castle walls presented their own catalogue of horrors. Massive oak beams, some weighing several tons, were held in place by primitive joinery techniques and iron fittings that corroded over time. When these supports failed, they didn't fail quietly. They came crashing down with bone-crushing force, often triggered by nothing more than a strong wind or the vibrations from heavy footsteps above. The Great Hall of Kenilworth Castle still bears scars from one such collapse in the 14th century, when a supporting beam gave way during a feast, killing 12 guests instantly. But perhaps nowhere were the structural dangers more concentrated than in the castle's towers. These soaring monuments to medieval ambition were essentially vertical death traps, their spiral staircases winding upward in an endless helical nightmare. The steps themselves were carved from stone, but decades of foot traffic had worn them smooth and treacherous. In wet weather, they became as slippery as ice. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris recorded one particularly gruesome incident at the Tower of London, where a guard carrying a torch slipped on the rain-slicked steps and tumbled down 3 full flights, his burning torch setting fire to the rushes scattered on the landing below. The narrow windows that punctuated these towers, designed to admit just enough light to see by while remaining defensible, created their own hazards. Children and small adults could easily slip through the wider arrow slits, plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. The window seats, carved from the same stone as the walls, were positioned at exactly the wrong height to provide safety. Too low to serve as proper barriers, too high to step over easily, they became stumbling blocks that sent countless castle residents tumbling backward into empty air. Even the castle's water systems, essential for survival during sieges, harboured deadly secrets. Wells were often dug so deep that their sides became unstable, collapsing without warning and entombing anyone unlucky enough to be drawing water at the time. The elaborate cisterns that collected rainwater from the castle's roofs became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Worse still, these standing pools of water often became contaminated with the decaying corpses of birds, rats, and occasionally human remains that had fallen from the battlements above. The castle's kitchens, located in separate buildings to reduce fire risk, presented their own unique dangers. The massive fireplaces required to feed hundreds of people generated such intense heat that the stone walls around them would crack and crumble. Kitchen workers regularly suffered severe burns from exploding pottery and scalding liquids. The smoke from these fires, with nowhere to go but up through primitive chimneys, would often back up and fill the kitchen with choking fumes. More than one cook met their end by collapsing unconscious into their own cooking fires. The great halls where castle life centered were perhaps the most deceptively dangerous spaces of all. Their soaring timber roofs, marvels of medieval engineering, were held together by complex networks of wooden joints and iron bolts. Over time, the immense weight of these structures would cause the walls to bow outward, creating stress fractures that spiderwebbed through the stone. When these roofs finally collapsed, they did so with such force that they could punch through multiple floors below, creating vertical shafts of destruction that claimed lives throughout the castle. The floors themselves were another source of constant peril. In the finest castles, they might be covered with elaborately painted tiles, but these decorative surfaces became treacherously slippery when wet. More commonly, floors were simply packed earth covered with rushes or straw. This organic matter, mixed with spilled food, human waste, and the blood from countless small injuries, created a festering carpet that harboured disease and concealed dangerous obstacles. Chroniclers tell of nobles breaking their necks after tripping over refuse hidden beneath the floor coverings. The very furniture within these castles was designed more for display than safety. Massive wooden tables, benches, and chairs were built to last centuries, but their sheer weight made them capable of crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them when they toppled. The great chair in the hall at Warwick Castle, carved from a single piece of oak and weighing nearly half a ton, was said to have killed 3 earls over the course of 2 centuries, each crushed when the ancient wood finally gave way beneath them. Perhaps most insidiously dangerous were the castle's decorative elements. Tapestries hanging on stone walls might seem harmless, but they were death traps waiting to happen. Woven from wool and treated with various chemicals to preserve their colours, they were essentially enormous candles waiting for a spark. When they caught fire, they burned with terrifying speed, filling rooms with toxic smoke and creating walls of flame that blocked escape routes. The heavy metal rings and rods used to hang these tapestries frequently pulled free from crumbling mortar, sending yards of burning fabric cascading down onto anyone below. The iron braziers used to heat these vast spaces were equally treacherous. Filled with glowing charcoal or burning wood, they gave off deadly carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated rooms. Castle dwellers would simply fall asleep and never wake up, victims of an invisible killer that left no trace. The braziers themselves, standing on 3 or 4 legs, were notoriously unstable. A careless bump or a warped leg could send burning coals scattering across wooden floors or into piles of straw bedding. Even the most basic activities of daily life were fraught with danger in these stone fortresses. Climbing stairs in the dark was a nightly gamble with death, as the uneven steps and low ceilings created a perfect storm of hazards. The narrow corridors that connected different parts of the castle were often pitch black, forcing residents to navigate by feel along walls that might conceal sharp projections, loose stones, or sudden openings that led to fatal drops. The seasonal changes that brought relief to those living in the countryside only intensified the dangers within castle walls. Winter ice made every surface treacherous, while spring thaws could cause catastrophic structural failures as frozen mortar expanded and contracted. Summer heat would cause the iron fittings throughout the castle to expand, sometimes bursting through the stone that contained them. Autumn storms would send loose stones tumbling from the battlements and tear away sections of roof that had been weakened by years of weather. Yet for all these dangers, medieval people continued to build and inhabit these stone fortresses, driven by the harsh realities of their violent age. They accepted the risks because the alternatives were often worse. A castle might be a death trap, but it was also the only refuge available in a world where warfare was constant and survival uncertain. The very features that made these structures so dangerous to their inhabitants also made them formidable barriers to their enemies. Word count 1372. This continuation maintains the engaging narrative style while exploring the structural and architectural dangers of medieval castles, building upon your established themes of how these fortresses were as dangerous to their inhabitants as they were to their enemies. Here is part 3 of the 12-part script for Why Medieval Castles Were Death Traps. The very kitchens that sustained castle life were themselves chambers of horror waiting to claim the unwary. Massive open hearths roared with flames that could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, their hungry mouths demanding constant feeding with timber and charcoal. Kitchen servants, already weakened by poor nutrition and exhausting labor, worked in clouds of choking smoke that filled their lungs with soot and ash. The heat was so intense that cooks frequently collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies unable to cope with the relentless assault of scorching air and billowing smoke. But the fires were only the beginning of the kitchen's deadly arsenal. Enormous cauldrons, some large enough to hold an entire pig, hung suspended over the flames on chains that had been forged decades earlier. Metal fatigue was a concept unknown to medieval engineers, and these chains would snap without warning, sending hundreds of pounds of boiling liquid and scalding metal crashing down upon anyone unfortunate enough to be working below. The stone floors, perpetually slick with grease and spilled liquids, became treacherous skating rinks where a single misstep could send a servant tumbling into the blazing hearth. The very act of food preparation was fraught with mortal peril. Massive wooden tables, scarred by countless knife strikes and saturated with the blood and juices of butchered animals, harbored colonies of bacteria that would have horrified modern food safety inspectors. Meat hung for days or even weeks in poorly ventilated storage areas, developing a greenish tint and putrid odor that cooks attempted to mask with liberal applications of expensive spices. What they couldn't mask, however, were the invisible armies of pathogens that thrived in these conditions, ready to strike down lord and servant alike with waves of dysentery, food poisoning, and worse. The castle's food storage systems were architectural nightmares in their own right. Granaries built into the thick walls or housed in separate towers were designed to withstand siege conditions but created perfect breeding grounds for rats, mice, and insects. These vermin didn't simply consume the stored grain, they contaminated it with their droppings and urine, spreading disease throughout the castle's food supply. The grain itself, stored in conditions of perpetual dampness, frequently developed deadly molds that produced toxins capable of causing hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Water, that most basic necessity of life, presented its own catalogue of horrors within castle walls. Most castles drew their water from wells that had been dug through the castle's foundation, often penetrating deep into the bedrock below. But these wells, while providing a secure water source during sieges, were frequently contaminated by seepage from the castle's primitive sewage systems. The very walls that protected the inhabitants also trapped the toxic runoff from latrines, stables, and workshops, allowing it to seep slowly through the stone and into the water supply. The castle's cisterns and storage tanks, carved from stone or constructed from timber and lead, became stagnant pools of contamination. Without any understanding of water purification or the importance of circulation, these reservoirs developed thick films of algae and bacterial growth that turned the water green and foul-smelling. Servants would skim the surface scum before drawing water for cooking and drinking, but they had no way to address the deeper contamination that lurked beneath. Even the act of drawing water from these sources was dangerous. Wells were often located in the deepest parts of the castle, accessible only by narrow spiral staircases carved into the living rock. These passages, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and perpetually damp from water seepage, were treacherous even in daylight. By torchlight or candlelight, they became death traps where a single misstep could send a servant plummeting into the dark depths below. The castle's inhabitants had developed a complex hierarchy of water usage that reflected both social status and survival instinct. The lord and his family received the first draw from the wells, theoretically, the cleanest water available. Lower-ranking nobles and important guests received the second draw, while servants and soldiers made do with whatever remained. By the time the water reached the lowest levels of castle society, it was often little more than a murky, foul-tasting liquid that bore only a passing resemblance to actual water. But even the highest quality water available in medieval castles would have been considered unfit for consumption by modern standards. The complete absence of any filtration or purification systems meant that every drop was potentially contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens. Waterborne diseases swept through castle populations with devastating regularity, claiming victims regardless of their social standing or position within the castle hierarchy. The sleeping quarters, those spaces where castle inhabitants sought rest and recovery from their daily struggles, were themselves sources of constant peril. The great chambers of the nobility, while spacious by medieval standards, were heated by massive fireplaces that consumed enormous quantities of wood and produced equally enormous quantities of smoke and toxic fumes. The chimneys, architectural marvels for their time, were frequently poorly designed and inadequately maintained, allowing smoke and carbon monoxide to back up into the living spaces. Beds, those symbols of comfort and luxury, were in reality elaborate death traps waiting to claim the unwary. The massive four-poster beds, favoured by the nobility, were constructed from heavy timber beams that had been inadequately seasoned and were prone to splitting and collapse. The wooden joints, held together by primitive iron fittings and wooden pegs, would work loose over time, creating instability that could send the entire structure crashing down on its occupants. The heavy curtains that surrounded these beds, designed to provide privacy and warmth, also created perfect conditions for fires to start and spread undetected. The mattresses themselves were stuffed with straw, feathers, and other organic materials that provided ideal breeding grounds for insects, mites, and other parasites. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were constant companions for castle inhabitants, regardless of their social status. These parasites didn't simply cause discomfort. They served as vectors for serious diseases including typhus, plague, and a host of other potentially fatal conditions. Even the act of sleeping became a calculated risk in medieval castles. The combination of poor ventilation, toxic fumes from heating systems, and the presence of numerous parasites meant that many castle inhabitants never experienced truly restful sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation weakened immune systems and made individuals more susceptible to the various diseases and ailments that plagued castle life. The castle's workshops and craft areas, essential for maintaining the complex infrastructure of medieval fortress life, were perhaps the most dangerous spaces of all. Blacksmith shops, located within the castle walls for security reasons, filled entire sections of the structure with choking smoke, toxic fumes, and the constant risk of fire. The forges, burning at temperatures that could melt iron, created heat so intense that it could ignite wooden beams and thatch roofing from several feet away. Metalworking produced clouds of toxic vapors that contained lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that slowly poisoned anyone who breathed them regularly. Blacksmiths and their apprentices frequently suffered from what we now recognize as heavy metal poisoning, developing tremors, mental confusion, and eventually death from the cumulative effects of their toxic work environment. The constant hammering and metalworking created noise levels that would have exceeded modern workplace safety standards by enormous margins. This perpetual cacophony didn't simply cause hearing loss, it created stress and anxiety that weakened the immune systems of everyone within the castle walls. The combination of toxic fumes, extreme heat, deafening noise, and dangerous equipment made the workshops some of the most hazardous environments in an already perilous world. Carpentry shops, essential for maintaining the wooden infrastructure of castle life, presented their own catalogue of dangers. The tools available to medieval craftsmen were crude by modern standards, lacking the safety features and precision engineering that we take for granted today. Handsaws with irregular teeth, axes with loose heads, and chisels with damaged handles were common tools that frequently caused serious injuries or death. The wood itself was often green or poorly seasoned, making it unpredictable to work with and prone to splitting or splintering without warning. Sawdust and wood shavings created fire hazards throughout the workshop areas, and the primitive ventilation systems did little to remove these combustible materials from the air. A single spark from a torch or candle could ignite an entire workshop, and the resulting fire could easily spread throughout the wooden portions of the castle structure. Storage areas within castles were architectural minefields that claimed victims on a regular basis. Armories, packed with weapons and armor, were poorly organized and inadequately secured. Heavy weapons would shift and fall without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. Swords and other bladed weapons were often stored in unstable racks that could collapse, sending sharp metal flying in all directions. The armor storage areas were particularly treacherous, filled with suits of mail and plate that weighed hundreds of pounds each. These massive pieces of equipment were hung on wooden pegs and iron hooks that were frequently inadequate for the weight they were expected to support. When these storage systems failed, they created avalanches of metal that could kill or seriously injure anyone in their path. Food storage areas, as we've already discussed, were breeding grounds for vermin and disease, but they also presented physical dangers that were equally severe. Enormous barrels of wine, ale, and other liquids were stacked in precarious towers that could topple without warning. Grain sacks, some weighing several hundred pounds each, were piled to dangerous heights in storage chambers with inadequate structural support. The very architecture of these storage areas worked against the safety of those who used them. Narrow doorways and low ceilings made it difficult to maneuver large items safely, while poor lighting created conditions where accidents were almost inevitable. The stone floors, perpetually damp and often covered with spilled liquids and organic debris, provided treacherous footing for anyone attempting to navigate these dangerous spaces. As we delve deeper into the deadly reality of medieval castle life, it becomes increasingly clear that these structures were not the romantic havens of chivalry and nobility that popular imagination has created. They were, instead, elaborate death traps, where every aspect of daily existence carried the potential for injury, disease, or death. The very features that made castles effective defensive structures also made them extraordinarily dangerous places to live and work. From the kitchens where servants laboured over roaring fires and toxic fumes, to the workshops where craftsmen risked their lives daily with primitive tools and dangerous materials, medieval castles were environments where survival itself was a constant struggle. The sleeping quarters offered little respite from danger, while the storage areas and water systems created their own catalogues of potential disasters. Yet perhaps most remarkably, people continued to live in these structures, driven by the harsh realities of medieval life, where the protection offered by castle walls, however dangerous, was preferable to the alternatives that existed beyond them. The story of medieval castles is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of extraordinary adversity, where men and women accepted tremendous risks as the price of survival in an unforgiving world. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue part 4 of Why Medieval Castles Were Death Traps, focusing on the deadly daily life within castle walls. Here's the script. The daily routine of castle life was itself a gauntlet of potential death. Every morning, inhabitants would wake to rooms thick with smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces, their lungs slowly filling with toxic fumes that would, over years, lead to chronic respiratory ailments. The very act of getting dressed could prove fatal, as clothing was rarely washed and harboured disease-carrying parasites that spread typhus and other deadly infections. Breakfast, if you could call it that, consisted of stale bread that might contain ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The ale served alongside it was often contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, while the water drawn from castle wells was frequently polluted by seepage from nearby latrines. In winter, when wells froze, inhabitants would melt snow that had been contaminated by animal waste and rotting organic matter. The very architecture that made castles formidable also made them death traps for their residents. Spiral staircases were deliberately built to favour right-handed defenders, but this same design made them treacherous for daily use. The narrow, uneven steps, worn smooth by countless feet, became slippery death slides when wet. Many castle dwellers met their end tumbling down these stone spirals, their bodies broken on the unforgiving steps below. Consider the fate of Lady Eleanor de Montfort, who in 1284 was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase in Kenilworth Castle, her neck snapped from the fall. Or the young page, William of Ashby, who slipped on the rain-soaked steps of Warwick Castle in 1312, his skull crushed against the stone walls. These weren't isolated incidents, but common occurrences that claimed lives with brutal regularity. The great halls, those grand symbols of medieval power, were particularly hazardous environments. Massive wooden beams, weakened by age, and the constant expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes, would occasionally crash down without warning. In 1301, a feast at Carefully Castle was interrupted when a supporting beam collapsed, crushing 3 guests instantly and maiming several others. The incident was hushed up, but records show that structural failures claimed lives in castles across Europe with alarming frequency. Fire was perhaps the greatest threat to castle inhabitants. Despite being built of stone, medieval castles were filled with flammable materials, wooden furniture, tapestries, rushes on floors, and thatched roofs on interior buildings. Once a fire started, it spread with terrifying speed through the confined spaces. The thick stone walls that protected against armies became ovens that trapped inhabitants in infernos they couldn't escape. The Great Fire at Windsor Castle in 1296 offers a harrowing example. It began in the kitchen when fat from roasting meat ignited and spread to wooden shelving. Within minutes, the entire kitchen was ablaze. The fire raced through connecting passages, fed by drafts that turned the castle's defensive ventilation system into a network of flues. 17 people died that night, including the head cook, who was trapped when burning timbers blocked his escape route. Their charred remains were found days later, huddled in corners where they had sought refuge from the flames. Even more insidious were the slow, invisible killers that lurked within castle walls. Lead poisoning was rampant among the upper classes, who drank wine from lead-glazed pottery and ate food prepared in lead-lined vessels. The symptoms, abdominal pain, confusion, and gradual mental deterioration, were often mistaken for other ailments. Many noble families suffered from what they called the wasting sickness, never realizing they were slowly poisoning themselves with their own tableware. The castle's defensive features created additional hazards for residents. Murder holes, designed to rain death upon attackers, were just as dangerous to those above them. Castle records from Conwy show that in 1295, a guard named Thomas the Fletcher fell through a murder hole while on duty, plummeting 30 feet to his death on the stone floor below. The iron grating that should have prevented such accidents had rusted through, but no one had noticed until it was too late. Battlements and wall walks, essential for defense, claimed numerous lives through falls. Guards walking their posts in darkness, rain, or snow would slip on wet stone or lose their footing on crumbling masonry. At Caernarvon Castle, a section of the wall walk collapsed in 1294, sending 2 sentries plummeting to their deaths. The castle's constable noted in his records that the stones did give way beneath their feet, and they were dashed upon the rocks below like broken dolls. The castle's water supply, drawn from deep wells or cisterns, was a constant source of disease and death. These water sources were often contaminated by runoff from the castle's many inhabitants, both human and animal. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly through castle populations drinking from these polluted sources. At Harlech Castle, an outbreak of dysentery in 1295 killed nearly half the garrison, their bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Even the castle's food storage areas were death traps. Granaries and storerooms, typically located in the lower levels of towers, were breeding grounds for rats and other vermin that carried plague and other diseases. The stored grain itself often became mouldy, producing toxins that caused severe illness or death. In 1289, an entire family at Beaumaris Castle died after eating bread made from contaminated flour, their bodies racked with convulsions before they finally succumbed. The castle's chapel, meant to provide spiritual solace, could become a tomb. These sacred spaces were often poorly ventilated, and during religious services, the combination of incense, candle smoke, and the breath of many worshippers created a toxic atmosphere. At Pembroke Castle, morning mass in 1302 was interrupted when several congregants collapsed from smoke inhalation. 3 elderly residents died before they could be carried to fresh air. Personal hygiene in castles was virtually non-existent, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Bathing was rare and considered unhealthy by many medieval physicians. When people did bathe, they often shared the same water, creating a soup of bacteria and parasites. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions, spreading typhus and other deadly diseases through the close-knit castle community. The castle's defensive isolation, while protecting against external enemies, created internal dangers when medical emergencies arose. When someone fell seriously ill or was injured, help was often days away. Simple infections became fatal without proper treatment, and injuries that might be survivable today proved deadly in the medieval castle environment. At Caerphilly Castle, records show that a kitchen maid named Agnes died from an infected cut on her hand. A wound that modern medicine could have treated with antibiotics became a death sentence in the medieval world. Winter brought its own deadly challenges to castle life. The massive stone structures became freezing tombs, with temperatures inside barely above those outside. Hypothermia claimed the lives of the elderly and infirm, while frostbite was common among those who had to venture onto the walls for guard duty. At Harlech Castle, the winter of 1294 was so severe that 3 guards were found frozen to death at their posts, their bodies rigid with cold. The very stones of the castle could become weapons against their inhabitants. Medieval mortar was often mixed with sand that contained salt, which absorbed moisture from the air. Over time, this caused the mortar to expand and contract, loosening stones that could fall without warning. At Conway Castle, a loose stone from the Great Hall ceiling struck and killed Sir Hugh de Lacy in 1298, crushing his skull as he dined below. Even the castle's domestic animals posed deadly threats. Horses, essential for medieval warfare and transportation, were kept in stables within the castle walls. These powerful animals, stressed by confinement and poor conditions, could turn violent without warning. Castle records are filled with accounts of stable hands, trampled to death or kicked by frightened horses. Dogs, used for hunting and protection, could turn rabid, spreading the disease through bites before anyone recognized the danger. The psychological toll of castle life cannot be overlooked as a contributing factor to its deadliness. The constant threat of attack, the isolation, and the harsh living conditions created severe mental stress that manifested in depression, paranoia, and violence. Suicide was not uncommon, with desperate inhabitants throwing themselves from the very walls meant to protect them. At Beaumaris Castle, the chaplain's records note 3 suicides in 1299 alone, describing them as souls driven to despair by the darkness of their earthly prison. Food poisoning was a constant threat in castle kitchens, where primitive preservation methods and poor hygiene created perfect conditions for bacterial contamination. Meat was often hung for days in warm conditions, developing dangerous levels of bacteria. Salt used for preservation was expensive and often used sparingly, allowing spoilage to set in. At Cianovan Castle, a feast celebrating the completion of the Outer Ward turned tragic when contaminated pork sickened dozens of guests. 7 died over the following days, their bodies racked with violent illness. The castle's defensive features could trap inhabitants during emergencies. The same portcullises and heavy gates that kept enemies out could prevent escape during fires or other disasters. At Pembroke Castle, a fire in 1305 spread so quickly that many inhabitants found themselves trapped behind locked gates, the keys held by guards who had already fled or perished. Their screams echoed through the night as they burned alive, unable to escape their stone prison. Medieval castles were also plagued by structural defects that weren't apparent until disaster struck. Foundations built on unstable ground could shift suddenly, causing walls to crack and collapse. At Caerphilly Castle, part of the south wall tilted dramatically due to foundation failure, creating a dangerous lean that persists to this day. While this particular collapse happened slowly enough that no one was killed, other castles weren't so fortunate. Sudden structural failures claimed lives with terrifying regularity. The very success of a castle's defensive design often contributed to the death of its inhabitants. The narrow windows, designed to prevent enemy arrows from finding their mark, also prevented adequate ventilation. This created stagnant air that harbored disease and allowed toxic fumes to accumulate. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires claimed many lives, with victims simply going to sleep and never waking up. As we've seen, medieval castles were as dangerous to their inhabitants as they were to their enemies. Every aspect of daily life, from the food they ate to the air they breathed, posed deadly threats. The very features that made these structures impregnable fortresses also made them death traps for those who called them home. In the next part of our series, we'll explore how the social hierarchy within castle walls, created additional layers of danger, where political intrigue and personal vendettas turned trusted allies into deadly enemies, making survival as much about navigating human threats as physical ones. Medieval castles, death traps, hidden in plain sight. The dungeons weren't the deadliest part of a medieval castle. In fact, the most dangerous places were the ones where people lived, worked, and tried to survive every single day. These towering symbols of power and protection were architectural nightmares waiting to claim their next victim. And the threats came from places you'd never expect. Consider the fate of Geoffrey de Montfort, a respected knight who met his end not in glorious battle, but tumbling down a castle's treacherous spiral staircase in the dead of night. His story wasn't unique. Castle records from across Europe tell of countless souls who perished within walls meant to protect them, victims of the very structures they called home. The medieval castle's design philosophy was brutally simple: keep enemies out at any cost. But this single-minded focus on defense created a web of internal hazards that made daily life a constant gamble with death. From the moment you stepped through the gatehouse to the highest tower chamber, every element of castle architecture harbored potential doom. Take the spiral staircases that connected the various levels. These weren't just difficult to navigate in heavy armor or flowing robes. They were death traps waiting to spring. Built narrow and steep to slow advancing enemies, they became slick with moisture, treacherous with wear, and utterly unforgiving in the dark. Castle inhabitants carried no modern lighting, just flickering candles or oil lamps that cast dancing shadows and created blind spots where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. The stairs themselves told a story of calculated lethality. Most spiraled clockwise, a deliberate choice that favored right-handed defenders swinging swords downward while hampering attackers climbing up. But this same design made them awkward for daily use. Servants carrying heavy loads, nobles in elaborate dress, and anyone moving quickly faced the constant threat of catching a foot, losing balance, or simply misjudging a step in the dim light. But the staircases were just the beginning. The very walls that promised protection were slowly collapsing from within. Medieval mortar, made from lime, sand, and water, began deteriorating the moment it dried. Without modern chemical stabilizers, these bindings cracked and crumbled under the weight of massive stone blocks. Castle walls developed what masons called stone sickness, a progressive weakening that could cause entire sections to collapse without warning. The chronicles of Château de Coucy tell of a horrific night in 1386 when a section of the Great Hall's wall simply gave way during a feast. 23 nobles and servants were crushed instantly, their bodies buried under tons of dressed stone. The survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by screams that echoed through the remaining chambers for hours. Water, that most basic necessity of life, became another vector of death within castle walls. Medieval engineers understood the need for water sources during sieges, so they dug wells deep into bedrock and collected rainwater in cisterns. But these same water systems became breeding grounds for disease and death. Castle wells frequently became contaminated with runoff from stables, kitchens, and worse, the primitive latrines that emptied near water sources. The well at Kenilworth Castle was found to contain not just water, but a toxic mixture of animal waste, rotting food scraps, and human remains that had somehow found their way into the supposedly pure water supply. Rainwater collections seemed safer, but castle cisterns were rarely cleaned and never covered properly. They became stagnant pools, hosting every parasite and bacteria that medieval Europe had to offer. The water grew thick with algae, swarmed with insects, and developed a taste so foul that even desperate castle inhabitants sometimes chose to risk dying of thirst rather than drink it. The kitchen water supplies were particularly deadly. Cooks used the same water for washing, cooking, and drinking, creating a cycle of contamination that spread illness throughout the castle community. Food poisoning was so common that castle physicians developed an entire catalogue of treatments for what they called kitchen fever, violent digestive ailments that could kill within days. Fire presented perhaps the most terrifying threat of all. Medieval castles were tinderboxes disguised as stone fortresses. While the walls might be stone, everything inside was combustible. Wooden floors, furniture, tapestries, rushes scattered on floors for warmth, and the constant presence of open flames created perfect conditions for catastrophic fires. The Great Fire of Warwick Castle in 1871 might seem too recent for our medieval focus, but it demonstrated vulnerabilities that had existed for centuries. When fire took hold in a castle, the same thick walls that kept enemies out trapped inhabitants inside. Narrow windows became death traps, stairs filled with smoke, and the maze-like layout that confused invaders became a fatal puzzle for those trying to escape. Medieval firefighting techniques were primitive at best. Castle inhabitants relied on bucket brigades, sand, and sometimes wet blankets to combat flames. But when fire erupted in the middle of the night, often starting in kitchens where cooking fires were banked with coals, the blaze could spread faster than any human response. The Tower of London's chronicles describe a fire in 1512 that began in the royal kitchens and spread through the timber galleries connecting various buildings. The thick stone walls that should have contained the fire instead created a chimney effect, drawing flames upward and outward until entire sections of the castle were consumed. 7 people died, not from burns, but from smoke inhalation as they became lost in corridors they'd walked hundreds of times before. Even more insidious were the slow-burning fires that smouldered in walls and floors for days before erupting. Medieval construction techniques often left gaps filled with combustible materials. Wood shavings, straw, and fabric scraps used as insulation. These materials could catch a spark and burn slowly, undetected, until they reached a point where the fire exploded into deadly life. The everyday architecture of castle life was riddled with hazards that modern building codes would never permit. Floor joists, often made from green timber that shrank as it dried, created gaps and weak spots. Stone floors, constantly damp from poor drainage, became slippery and treacherous. Ceiling beams, massive as they were, could fail without warning as the wood aged and the metal brackets that held them corroded. Castle chambers were death traps in their own right. The great halls, designed to impress and intimidate, featured soaring ceilings supported by complex networks of beams and arches. When these supports failed, they didn't fail quietly. The collapse of Westminster Hall's roof in 1291 killed 12 people and injured dozens more. Their bodies crushed under timber beams that had seemed solid just moments before. Private chambers presented different but equally deadly hazards. Fireplaces, essential for heat and light, were poorly ventilated and often leaked deadly carbon monoxide into living spaces. The rich tapestries that decorated walls trapped smoke and toxic fumes, creating pockets of poisoned air that could kill sleeping occupants. Window openings, designed narrow to prevent enemy arrows, created their own dangers. People leaning out to empty chamber pots, observe courtyard activities, or simply get fresh air regularly fell to their deaths. The chronicles of Edinburgh Castle record at least 15 deaths from window falls between 1400 and 1450, including 2 children who were playing near unguarded openings. The most tragic aspect of castle deaths was how preventable many of them were. But medieval priorities didn't include safety regulations, building inspections, or maintenance standards. Castles were built to serve military functions, and human comfort, much less human safety, was a secondary consideration at best. workers tasked with castle maintenance faced their own deadly challenges. Stonemasons working on repairs often laboured without safety equipment on walls hundreds of feet above the ground. Carpenters replacing rotted beams worked in cramped spaces with heavy timbers and primitive tools. Kitchen staff dealt with massive cooking fires, boiling oil for defence, and primitive equipment that regularly caused severe burns and injuries. The irony wasn't lost on medieval chroniclers, who noted that more castle inhabitants died from the castle itself than from enemy action. These fortresses, built at enormous cost in money and human life, were more dangerous to their residents than the wars they were designed to survive. Some castles developed reputations as particularly deadly. Chateau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's supposedly impregnable fortress, was known among soldiers as the Widowmaker, not for its military effectiveness, but for the number of inhabitants who died from structural failures, fires, and accidents. Even before enemy siege engines could batter its walls, Chateau Gaillard was claiming lives through the everyday hazards of medieval castle life. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of architectural death cannot be understated. Castle inhabitants developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to ward off structural disasters. They blessed doorways, avoided certain staircases during storms, and carried charms meant to protect against falling stones. These weren't just medieval quirks. They were rational responses to genuine daily threats. As we've seen, medieval castles were masterpieces of defensive architecture, but they were also death traps that claimed countless lives through structural failures, environmental hazards, and the inevitable consequences of prioritizing military function over human safety. These magnificent fortresses, symbols of power and protection, were ultimately as dangerous to those who lived within their walls as they were to the enemies who dared assault them from without. The medieval castle stands as a monument to human ambition and ingenuity, but also as a stark reminder that even our greatest architectural achievements can become our most deadly environments when safety takes a back seat to other priorities. Looking at your previous script content and the reference materials, here's part 6 of your 12-part script about why medieval castles were death traps. The dangers lurking within medieval castle walls extended far beyond the obvious architectural hazards we've already explored. Hidden within the very stones and mortar of these fortifications were threats that claimed lives, through means their builders never intended or anticipated. The elaborate defensive systems designed to keep enemies out often became elaborate traps for those living within. Consider the ingenious but deadly mechanism of the portcullis. This massive iron grating, suspended by chains and counterweights above the main gateway, served as the castle's primary barrier against invasion. When functioning properly, it could be lowered swiftly to seal off attackers. But these mechanisms were prone to catastrophic failure. The heavy iron gates weighed several tons, and the primitive rope and chain systems supporting them were under constant strain from weather, rust, and the simple passage of time. Historical records from Warwick Castle tell of a horrific incident in 1312 when the portcullis mechanism failed during a routine inspection. The massive gate plummeted without warning, crushing 2 guards who were examining the gateway below. The impact was so severe that their bodies were completely flattened, a grisly reminder that the castle's own defences could turn deadly in an instant. Similar accidents occurred with alarming frequency across medieval Europe, as castle inhabitants learned too late that their protective barriers were double-edged swords. The murder holes built into castle gatehouses presented another insidious threat to daily life. These openings in the ceiling, designed to allow defenders to rain down arrows, boiling oil, or stones upon attackers, created permanent weak points in the castle's structure. Over time, the constant moisture from rain and the corrosive effects of the substances poured through them weakened the surrounding stonework. Chunks of masonry would break away without warning, plummeting onto anyone unfortunate enough to be passing below. At Carefully Castle in Wales, a section of murder-hole stonework collapsed in 1389, killing a merchant who was simply delivering goods to the kitchens. The man had made this same journey dozens of times before, never suspecting that the innocent-looking ceiling above concealed a death trap years in the making. His death sparked panic among the castle's inhabitants, who suddenly realized that any corridor, any doorway, any seemingly safe passage could harbor similar threats. The very design philosophy behind medieval castles created an environment where accidents were not just possible, but inevitable. Every feature served a military purpose first, with human safety as a distant secondary concern. The narrow spiral staircases that wound through castle towers were deliberately built to favor right-handed defenders, swinging swords downward at ascending attackers. But this same design made them treacherous for everyday use, especially in the dim light of torches and oil lamps. These staircases claimed victims regularly. The steps were often uneven, worn smooth by countless feet, and slippery from moisture that seeped through the stone walls. Servants carrying heavy loads, children at play, and elderly residents all fell prey to these deadly spirals. At Conwy Castle, records show that no fewer than 7 people died in stairway accidents during a single harsh winter in 1294, their bodies discovered only when the spring thaw allowed proper searches of the castle's remote corners. The windows of medieval castles, while providing necessary light and ventilation, were designed primarily as defensive positions for archers. They were narrow on the outside to prevent enemy arrows from finding their mark, but opened wide on the interior to give defenders room to maneuver their weapons. This created deep, funnel-shaped openings that were essentially unguarded precipices within the castle walls. Children were particularly vulnerable to these window traps. The wide interior sills seemed like perfect places to sit and play, offering respite from the cramped living quarters. But one moment of carelessness, one slip or stumble, could send a child plummeting through the narrow opening to the ground far below. The pipe rolls of Henry II, record payments for the burial of 3 children at Corfe Castle, who died in such accidents during the winter of 1176. Even adults were not immune to the deadly allure of these windows. During celebrations or times of stress, when wine flowed freely and judgment became impaired, castle inhabitants sometimes mistook the deceptive interior space for actual safety. The wide sill could accommodate a person easily, but the narrow exterior opening provided no barrier against a fatal fall. Many a drunken knight or servant met their end this way, their bodies discovered the next morning in the courtyard below. The defensive features known as machicolations presented yet another threat to castle dwellers. These stone projections extending from the walls allowed defenders to drop objects directly onto attackers below. But like murder holes, they created structural vulnerabilities that worsened over time. The corbels supporting these overhangs were subjected to tremendous stress from wind, weather, and their own weight. When they failed catastrophically. At Château de Vincennes, near Paris, an entire machicolation collapsed in 1367, taking with it a section of the castle wall and killing 5 people in the courtyard below. The stonework had shown no obvious signs of weakness before the collapse, leading to widespread fear among castle inhabitants about which defensive feature might fail next. This paranoia was not unfounded, as similar collapses occurred regularly throughout the medieval period. The integration of defensive systems into daily living spaces created a unique form of environmental hazard. Unlike modern buildings, where safety features are designed to protect occupants, medieval castles prioritized military effectiveness over human welfare. This meant that residents lived in constant proximity to mechanisms and structures designed for warfare, not habitation. The great halls, seemingly the safest spaces within a castle, harbored their own hidden dangers. The massive wooden beams supporting their roofs were often green timber, installed before proper seasoning. Over time, these beams would shrink, warp, and weaken. The load they carried was immense, supporting not just the roof, but often additional floors and defensive positions above. When these beams failed, they didn't crack gradually but snapped suddenly, bringing down tons of timber and stone onto anyone below. Bamberg Castle experienced such a catastrophic beam failure during a feast in 1333. The Great Hall was packed with nobles and their retinues celebrating a successful harvest when a primary support beam snapped without warning. The section of roof it supported crashed down onto the high table, killing the lord of the castle and 6 of his guests instantly. The survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by screams and the settling of debris that lasted for what seemed like hours. The heating systems in medieval castles created another layer of danger that inhabitants learned to navigate daily. The great fireplaces that provided warmth were massive affairs, designed to heat large spaces efficiently. But their size made them structurally challenging, requiring enormous chimneys and flues that created weak points in the castle walls. These chimneys were prone to blockage from debris, birds' nests, and structural settling, leading to dangerous buildups of smoke and gases within living spaces. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a silent killer in medieval castles, though it was not understood at the time. Families would simply go to sleep in their chambers and never wake up, victims of the odorless, colourless gas that accumulated when fireplaces drew poorly or chimneys became blocked. At Ludlow Castle, an entire family of minor nobles died this way in 1289, found peaceful in their beds but stone cold by morning. Such deaths were often attributed to divine will or mysterious ailments, as the true cause remained invisible and incomprehensible. The defensive ditches and moats surrounding castles created additional hazards for daily life. While they successfully deterred attackers, they also posed constant threats to castle inhabitants, who needed to traverse them regularly. Medieval moats were not the clean, water-filled barriers of romantic imagination, but often stagnant, sewage-contaminated trenches that bred disease and created treacherous footing. During winter, these water features became particularly deadly. Ice would form unevenly, creating surfaces that appeared solid, but could give way without warning. Many castle servants and residents fell through thin ice while attempting to cross moats or retrieve items that had fallen in. The weight of medieval clothing, especially when waterlogged, made escape from such accidents nearly impossible. Warwick Castle's records describe the drowning of a young page in 1278 who fell through the ice while attempting to retrieve a nobleman's glove that had blown into the moat. Despite the efforts of several men to rescue him, the boy's heavy woolen clothing and the shock of the freezing water prevented his escape. His body was not recovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of how even simple errands could turn fatal in the castle environment. The very success of a castle's defensive design often contributed to its deadliness for inhabitants. The more impregnable a fortress appeared, the more likely its residents were to develop a false sense of security about their environment. They focused on external threats, while becoming complacent about the internal dangers that surrounded them daily. This psychological trap was perhaps the most insidious hazard of all, as it prevented people from taking proper precautions against the very real threats posed by their own homes. The irony was profound and tragic. These mighty fortresses, built to protect life and property from human enemies, became environments where death stalked the innocent through means both subtle and sudden. The same features that made a castle defensible made it dangerous to inhabit. The thick walls that stopped arrows trapped toxic gases. The narrow passages that hindered attackers claimed the lives of children at play. The high positions that provided strategic advantage became fatal drops for the unwary. Medieval castles were indeed death traps, but not in the way their builders intended. They were monuments to the unintended consequences of prioritizing military function over human safety, creating environments where survival required constant vigilance against threats that came not from without, but from the very stones and structures meant to provide protection. Looking at the provided script summary and reference materials, I'll continue from where Part 6 left off, focusing on the environmental and psychological hazards that made medieval castles death traps for their inhabitants. Beyond the immediate physical dangers of collapse, fire, and contamination, medieval castles subjected their residents to a host of environmental hazards that could prove just as deadly over time. The very design features that made these fortresses so formidable against enemies often created treacherous conditions for those living within their walls. During the harsh winter months, castle inhabitants faced the constant threat of hypothermia and frostbite. The massive stone walls that provided protection against siege engines also acted as thermal conductors, drawing heat away from interior spaces and creating bone-chilling cold that could kill the weak, elderly, or sick. Ice would form on interior walls, making already slippery stone surfaces even more hazardous. Servants carrying heavy loads up and down icy staircases frequently slipped and fell, suffering broken bones or worse. The narrow arrow slits and small windows that prevented enemy archers from finding targets also severely limited natural light and ventilation. During winter storms, these openings had to be shuttered completely, plunging castle interiors into near-total darkness for days at a time. Residents stumbled through pitch-black corridors, falling down stairs, walking into walls, or accidentally stepping into open wells and cisterns. The lack of adequate lighting made every movement a potential death sentence. Water presented perhaps the most insidious environmental threat. Castle designers prioritized defensive considerations over drainage, creating structures that trapped moisture and humidity. Stagnant water collected in poorly designed courtyards, cellars, and defensive ditches, becoming breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and creating treacherous patches of ice in winter. The very moats that protected castles from assault became death traps for residents who might slip and fall into the murky depths during nighttime movements or while attempting to fetch water during sieges. Medieval castle dwellers also faced the psychological torment of prolonged isolation and confinement. During extended sieges, residents could be trapped within the castle walls for months, slowly consuming dwindling food supplies while watching friends and family members sicken and die. The constant stress of potential attack, combined with overcrowded living conditions and poor sanitation, created an atmosphere of paranoia and despair that drove some inhabitants to madness or suicide. The hierarchical nature of castle society meant that lower status residents bore the brunt of these environmental hazards, while lords and ladies occupied the relatively safer upper floors of keeps. Servants and soldiers were relegated to basement chambers, guard towers, and outer buildings where dangers multiplied. These unfortunate souls faced not only the structural risks of older, poorly maintained sections of the castle, but also the additional hazards of working in the most exposed and dangerous areas. Pest infestations added another layer of misery and danger to castle life. The thick stone walls and numerous hiding places provided perfect habitats for rats, which carried fleas infected with bubonic plague and other diseases. These rodents contaminated food stores, gnawed through wooden supports, and spread disease throughout the castle population. Medieval residents had no effective means of controlling these infestations, leaving them vulnerable to repeated waves of pestilence. The accumulation of human and animal waste within castle walls created a toxic environment that slowly poisoned inhabitants over time. Garderobes emptied into pits or chutes that often overflowed during heavy rains, sending sewage flowing through lower levels of the castle. The resulting contamination of water supplies and living spaces exposed residents to cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. Even those who survived the immediate effects of such diseases often suffered long-term health consequences that shortened their lives significantly. Perhaps most tragically, the very features that made castles symbols of power and prestige also made them elaborate death traps for the people they were meant to protect. The massive walls that projected strength could collapse without warning. The defensive mechanisms designed to repel invaders could malfunction and kill defenders. The water systems meant to sustain life during sieges could become conduits for disease and death. In their single-minded focus on military effectiveness, medieval castle builders created structures that were fundamentally hostile to human habitation. Every design decision prioritized defensive capability over safety, comfort, or health. The result was a building type that, while militarily impressive, subjected its inhabitants to a constant array of mortal dangers that claimed lives as surely as any enemy sword or siege engine. The irony of medieval castles is that they succeeded brilliantly at their intended purpose of military defense while simultaneously failing catastrophically at their secondary function of providing safe shelter for human beings. These monuments to medieval engineering prowess stand today as reminders not only of the ingenuity of their builders, but also of the terrible price paid by those who lived and died within their walls. In seeking to create impregnable fortresses, medieval architects inadvertently designed some of history's most elaborate and deadly death traps. Here's part 8 of the 12-part script for Why Medieval Castles Were Death Traps. Even the simplest daily routines within castle walls posed extraordinary dangers to inhabitants. Take the matter of sleeping arrangements, something we consider a basic human comfort. In medieval castles, even rest itself could become a death sentence. The great halls where many servants and soldiers slept were death traps disguised as dormitories. These massive spaces, designed to accommodate dozens of people, created a perfect storm of hazardous conditions that could turn a peaceful night's sleep into a nightmare of injury or death. Picture sleeping shoulder to shoulder with 50 other souls on straw pallets scattered across cold stone floors. The communal sleeping arrangements meant that disease spread like wildfire through the ranks. When one person fell ill with plague, typhoid, or any number of medieval maladies, the entire hall became infected within days. The straw bedding, rarely changed and often crawling with vermin, harbored fleas and lice that carried deadly diseases from person to person. Many inhabitants would go to sleep healthy and wake up with the telltale signs of bubonic plague, or never wake up at all. The primitive heating systems posed their own lethal threats. Great hearths burned constantly to ward off the bitter cold, but these massive fires created invisible killers that claimed lives silently in the night. Carbon monoxide poisoning was rampant but completely misunderstood. Castle dwellers would seal shutters and doors against winter winds, trapping deadly gases inside. Many would simply fail to wake up, their families believing they had died peacefully in their sleep, never knowing that invisible fumes had slowly suffocated them. Even more treacherous were the sleeping arrangements in the upper chambers of castle towers. Noble families and important guests were housed in these supposedly prestigious quarters, but they were essentially death traps suspended high above the ground. The circular stairs leading to these chambers were deliberately designed as defensive features, spiraling clockwise to disadvantage attacking swordsmen. However, this same design made them incredibly dangerous for daily use, especially in darkness. Imagine stumbling down these narrow, uneven stone steps in the middle of the night, perhaps after consuming wine at dinner or when nature called urgently. There were no handrails, no consistent step heights, and certainly no lighting. The steps were often worn smooth by centuries of use, becoming treacherously slippery when wet. A single misstep could send someone tumbling down 20 or 30 stone steps, breaking bones or necks in the process. Many castle inhabitants met their end this way, their bodies discovered crumpled at the bottom of tower stairs come morning. The private chambers themselves harbored hidden dangers that could strike without warning. Heavy wooden beams, constantly expanding and contracting with temperature changes and bearing enormous weight, would occasionally fail catastrophically. These massive oak timbers, some weighing several tons, could crash down without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. The groaning and creaking of old wood was so common that inhabitants learned to ignore it, often missing the warning signs of imminent collapse. Window openings in sleeping chambers presented another deadly hazard. These apertures, designed primarily for defense rather than comfort, were often little more than narrow slits in thick stone walls. But in grander chambers, larger windows were sometimes installed, and these became death traps for the unwary. Without glass in many cases, or with only crude shutters for protection, people could easily fall through these openings, especially during winter months when ice made surfaces treacherous. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many noble families lost heirs to such accidents. The very beds themselves could become instruments of death. Heavy wooden frames, often elaborately carved and fitted with thick curtains for privacy and warmth, could collapse without warning. The rope supports that held straw mattresses would rot or snap, sending sleepers crashing to the floor. More insidiously, the enclosed nature of curtained beds created perfect conditions for suffocation. The heavy fabrics trapped carbon dioxide and reduced oxygen levels, particularly dangerous for elderly or infirm occupants who might not have the strength to push through heavy curtains if they became tangled. Personal belongings stored in sleeping chambers added another layer of danger. Heavy wooden chests, metal armor, and weapons were typically kept in bedchambers for security, but these items could shift and fall, particularly in upper floors where wind could cause the entire structure to sway. Many castle inhabitants were injured or killed by falling objects during storms, or even on calm nights when poorly secured items simply toppled over. The location of sleeping quarters within the castle's defensive structure meant that inhabitants were often the first to suffer when the castle's protective features failed. Rooms built into the outer walls were particularly vulnerable when siege engines breached the defenses. Residents might be sleeping peacefully when a catapult stone crashed through the wall above their heads, bringing down tons of masonry. During sieges, these chambers became obvious targets for enemy fire, turning bedrooms into kill zones. Perhaps most tragically, the very isolation of private sleeping chambers meant that when accidents or medical emergencies occurred during the night, help was often too far away. Someone suffering a heart attack, stroke, or severe injury might die alone in their chamber, their cries for help unheard through thick stone walls. The castle's defensive design, built to keep enemies out, also kept life-saving assistance from reaching those who needed it most urgently. Fire represented the ultimate nightmare for anyone sleeping in a medieval castle. The combination of wooden furnishings, straw bedding, and open flames for heating and lighting created tinderbox conditions. When fires started in sleeping quarters, they spread with terrifying speed through the dry materials. The narrow staircases and corridors that were designed to slow enemy advances became death traps for fleeing inhabitants. Many people died, not from the flames themselves, but from smoke inhalation as they tried desperately to escape through the castle's maze-like interior. The communal nature of castle life meant that privacy was rare, but it also meant that dangerous individuals might share sleeping spaces with the innocent. Mentally unstable servants, criminals pressed into service, or simply desperate people driven to violence by harsh conditions could pose threats to their sleeping companions. Without proper supervision or security in these shared spaces, assaults, thefts, and even murders occurred with disturbing frequency. Water damage from the castle's primitive plumbing and drainage systems frequently affected sleeping areas, creating dangerous conditions that could persist for months. Leaking roofs and walls would saturate wooden floors and support beams, causing them to rot and weaken. Many inhabitants fell through floors that appeared solid, but had been undermined by persistent moisture. The dampness also promoted the growth of deadly molds and fungi that poisoned the air and caused respiratory illnesses that could prove fatal over time. Even the act of dressing and undressing in these chambers carried risks. The combination of poor lighting, uneven floors, and heavy medieval clothing created numerous opportunities for accidents. People would trip over their own robes, catch clothing on protruding stones or wooden splinters, or lose their balance while putting on heavy boots or armor. These seemingly minor mishaps could result in serious injuries, particularly when they occurred near open windows or steep stairs. The psychological toll of sleeping in such dangerous conditions cannot be understated. The constant awareness of potential threats created chronic stress and sleep deprivation among castle inhabitants. This exhaustion led to poor judgment and increased accident rates during the day, creating a vicious cycle where the dangers of nighttime affected daytime safety as well. Many people developed severe anxiety about sleeping, leading to insomnia that further compromised their health and decision-making abilities. For servants and lower-ranking inhabitants, sleeping arrangements were even more precarious. They might be assigned spaces in the most dangerous parts of the castle, such as near the kitchens where fire risk was highest, or in partially ruined sections where structural integrity was questionable. These individuals had no choice but to accept whatever accommodations were provided, regardless of the obvious dangers they presented. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that sleeping conditions varied dramatically throughout the year, with each season bringing its own particular set of deadly hazards. Winter brought the risks of freezing, carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated heating, and ice-related accidents. Spring flooding could undermine foundations and create unstable sleeping areas. Summer heat could make upper chambers uninhabitable, forcing people into lower areas where other dangers lurked. Autumn storms could damage roofs and walls, sending debris crashing into sleeping quarters without warning. In the end, the simple human need for rest and sleep became yet another battlefield in the daily struggle for survival within medieval castle walls. Every night brought the possibility that sleep might become eternal, that rest might turn into death. The castle's inhabitants went to bed each evening knowing that they might not see another dawn, not because of enemy attack or siege, but because the very structure that was supposed to protect them had become their most intimate and persistent threat. In these fortresses where safety was supposed to reign supreme, even the most basic human activities carried the potential for sudden, unexpected death. Here's part 9 of the 12-part script for why medieval castles were death traps. As we've explored the countless hazards that plagued medieval castle life, from crumbling walls to contaminated water, there's one aspect of these fortresses that truly epitomize their deadly nature: the kitchens and food preparation areas. These spaces, meant to sustain life, became some of the most perilous environments within castle walls. Picture the great kitchen of a medieval castle, a cavernous space dominated by massive stone hearths that roared with constant flame. These cooking fires, essential for preparing meals for hundreds of inhabitants, created a perpetual inferno that could easily spiral out of control. The kitchen walls, blackened with decades of soot and grease, were essentially giant tinderboxes, waiting for a single spark to ignite them. Wooden beams overhead, dried by years of heat and saturated with cooking fats, could burst into flames with terrifying speed. The kitchen staff worked in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Scullery maids and kitchen boys scurried between blazing hearths, carrying buckets of scalding water and platters of searing meat. Burns were so common, they were considered an occupational hazard rather than an accident. Many kitchen workers bore the permanent scars of their trade, with hands and arms marked by countless encounters with hot metal, boiling liquids, and open flames. The very architecture of these kitchens created deadly traps. Narrow doorways that could accommodate only one person at a time became bottlenecks during emergencies. When fires broke out, which they did with alarming frequency, workers found themselves trapped between walls of flame with no escape route. The high stone walls that contained the heat also contained the people, turning the kitchen into a furnace with human fuel. Water, that most basic necessity, presented its own lethal challenges within castle kitchens. Wells were often contaminated by seepage from primitive sewage systems or tainted by the decomposing bodies of animals that had fallen into the water source. The castle's water supply frequently harbored deadly bacteria and parasites that could kill as efficiently as any sword. Kitchen workers who drank from these sources faced constant risk of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Food storage areas were breeding grounds for vermin and disease. Grain stores attracted rats by the thousands, and these rodents brought with them fleas carrying bubonic plague. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, often entered castles through their very kitchens and storerooms. Meat hung in cool chambers to cure would rot in warm weather, filling storage areas with toxic fumes and deadly bacteria. Even the salt used to preserve food could be contaminated with lead and other poisonous substances. The preparation of meals itself was fraught with danger. Massive cauldrons suspended over roaring fires could tip without warning, spilling boiling liquids across anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. Kitchen knives, kept razor-sharp for cutting through tough meat and bone, caused frequent accidents in the dim, smoke-filled environment. The combination of poor lighting, slippery floors, and deadly implements created a workplace where serious injury was not a matter of if, but when. Smoke from the cooking fires created another silent killer. Medieval kitchens had primitive ventilation systems at best, and the constant inhalation of thick, acrid smoke damaged the lungs of everyone who worked there. Many kitchen staff developed chronic respiratory conditions that slowly strangled their ability to breathe. The smoke also reduced visibility to dangerous levels, making it difficult to see hazards until it was too late. The hierarchy of castle kitchens created additional dangers for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Young apprentices and servants were often forced to perform the most dangerous tasks with little training or protection. They might be ordered to clean out hot ovens while embers still glowed, or to venture into smoke-filled storage areas to retrieve supplies during fires. Their expendable status meant their safety was rarely a concern for their superiors. Poisoning, whether accidental or intentional, was another constant threat in castle kitchens. Spoiled food was common due to poor preservation methods and lack of refrigeration. Cooks had to rely on smell and taste to determine if meat was safe to eat, but these senses were often dulled by the constant exposure to smoke and strong odors. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Lead poisoning from pewter plates and cups used in food preparation created slow, agonizing illness. The very people responsible for feeding the castle faced the greatest food insecurity. Kitchen workers were often fed scraps and leftovers, the least nutritious and most potentially dangerous portions of meals. Malnutrition weakened their immune systems, making them more susceptible to the diseases that flourished in the unsanitary kitchen environment. Ironically, those who prepared feasts for nobles often went hungry themselves. Accidents with cooking equipment were particularly gruesome in an age without proper medical care. A worker might be scalded by steam from a boiling pot, burned by molten fat, or crushed by falling equipment. Without antibiotics or proper wound care, even minor injuries could become infected and led to death. The primitive medical knowledge of the time meant that treatments were often more harmful than the original injury. The seasonal nature of food supplies created periods of extreme stress in castle kitchens. During times of siege or famine, kitchen staff were under enormous pressure to stretch dwindling supplies. They might be forced to prepare food from questionable sources, or to work longer hours under even more dangerous conditions. The desperation of these times led to increased accidents and poor decision-making that put everyone at risk. Even the act of obtaining ingredients could be deadly. Kitchen workers might be sent to gather herbs from areas where poisonous plants grew alongside edible ones. Without proper botanical knowledge, they could accidentally harvest deadly nightshade instead of edible berries, or confuse poisonous mushrooms with safe varieties. These mistakes could kill not just the gatherer, but anyone who consumed the resulting meal. The preservation methods used in medieval times created their own hazards. Smoking meat required tending fires for days, increasing the risk of burns and smoke inhalation. Salting food required handling large quantities of coarse salt that could cause severe cuts and chemical burns. Pickling involved working with strong acids that could cause blindness if splashed in the eyes. Fire remained the greatest threat of all in castle kitchens. The combination of open flames, wooden structures, and flammable materials created perfect conditions for catastrophic blazes. When kitchen fires spread, they could consume entire sections of a castle with terrifying speed. The narrow staircases and corridors that led to and from kitchens became death traps as people struggled to escape the advancing flames. The psychological toll of working in such dangerous conditions cannot be underestimated. Kitchen workers lived in constant fear of injury, illness, or death. This stress weakened their immune systems and made them more prone to accidents. The high turnover rate in castle kitchens was due not just to the physical dangers, but to the mental exhaustion of living under such constant threat. Water-related accidents were particularly common in castle kitchens. Wells and cisterns, essential for cooking and cleaning, were often inadequately covered or protected. Kitchen workers regularly fell into these water sources while drawing water in dark or icy conditions. The weight of full water buckets caused many to slip on wet stone floors, leading to broken bones and head injuries that could prove fatal. The irony of medieval castle kitchens was profound. The very spaces designed to sustain life became some of the most lethal areas within these fortifications. The daily necessity of preparing food transformed into a deadly gamble, where workers risked their lives to feed others. These kitchens embodied the fundamental contradiction of medieval castles themselves, structures built for protection that became monuments to human suffering and death. In examining these kitchen hazards, we see how the medieval approach to castle design prioritized military function over human safety at every level. From the grandest lord to the humblest scullery maid, no one was truly safe within these walls. The kitchens serve as a microcosm of the broader castle environment, where death lurked in every corner and survival was never guaranteed. The legacy of these dangerous kitchens reminds us that medieval castles, for all their impressive architecture and romantic appeal, were fundamentally places where human life was considered expendable in service of military and political goals. They stand as monuments not just to medieval engineering, but to the countless lives lost in their construction, maintenance, and daily operation. Why medieval castles were death traps, Part 10. As we've explored the countless hazards that plagued medieval castle life, from the obvious dangers of warfare to the hidden perils of everyday existence, we must now turn our attention to perhaps the most insidious threat of all, the psychological toll these fortress prisons exacted on their inhabitants. For while we've examined how medieval castles could kill the body through disease, accident, and structural failure, they were equally adept at slowly destroying the human spirit. Picture yourself confined within the massive stone walls of a medieval castle during the long winter months. The thick walls that promised protection from enemies also blocked out the sun's warming rays, leaving vast chambers perpetually shrouded in gloom. Small, narrow windows designed to prevent arrow attacks also prevented adequate light from penetrating the interior spaces. Oil lamps and candles provided only flickering, inadequate illumination, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on the mind during the endless dark hours. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest torment of all. Medieval castles were often built in remote, strategic locations far from populated areas. During times of siege or harsh weather, inhabitants could find themselves completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. The same moat that kept enemies out also kept the inhabitants trapped within, creating a sense of being buried alive within their stone tomb. Consider the plight of Lady Eleanor de Montfort, whose husband's castle in the Welsh borderlands was besieged during the winter of 1282. Her personal letters, discovered centuries later, reveal the gradual deterioration of her mental state as the siege dragged on for 4 months. Initially defiant and hopeful, her correspondence grew increasingly desperate and disjointed as the weeks passed. She wrote of hearing voices in the walls, of shadows moving in her peripheral vision, and of an overwhelming urge to throw herself from the castle's highest tower just to escape the suffocating confinement. The constant fear was another psychological poison that infected castle life. Even during peacetime, the very design of these fortresses served as a daily reminder of the violence that could erupt at any moment. Murder holes gaped overhead like hungry mouths. Arrow slits watched like sinister eyes. The portcullis hung like an executioner's blade, ready to crash down and trap inhabitants within or without. Living surrounded by such reminders of death and warfare took a profound toll on the human psyche. Children born and raised within castle walls often developed what medieval chroniclers described as fortress madness, a condition characterized by extreme anxiety when venturing beyond the castle walls, violent nightmares, and an obsessive fear of open spaces. These young souls, who should have been playing in meadows and exploring forests, instead grew up in a world of stone corridors and defensive positions, their natural development stunted by the oppressive environment. The air itself within these stone monuments became a psychological weapon. Poor ventilation meant that the atmosphere grew thick and stifling, particularly in the great halls where large numbers of people gathered. The smell of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, animal waste, and general decay created a perpetual miasma that clouded the mind and depressed the spirits. Many inhabitants reported feeling constantly drowsy and confused, unable to think clearly in the fetid atmosphere. Sleep, that most basic human need, became a torment rather than a relief within castle walls. The stone chambers amplified every sound, footsteps echoing through corridors, wind howling through arrow slits, the groaning and settling of massive stone blocks. What should have been restful slumber was instead broken by a constant symphony of unsettling noises that kept inhabitants in a state of perpetual nervous exhaustion. The social dynamics within these confined spaces created additional psychological pressures. Nobles, servants, soldiers, and craftsmen were all forced to live in extremely close proximity, yet rigid social hierarchies prevented natural human interaction. Servants could be executed for speaking too freely to their betters. Knights could lose their positions for showing weakness or emotion. The constant need to maintain proper social facades while living cheek by jowl with dozens or hundreds of other people created enormous psychological stress. Women, in particular, suffered under the psychological burden of castle life. Often married off to secure political alliances, they found themselves imprisoned in cold stone towers, far from family and friends, surrounded by strangers who viewed them primarily as valuable assets rather than human beings. The Countess of Pembroke, whose diary survived from the early 14th century, wrote movingly of her despair at being trapped in what she called her stone coffin, watching the seasons change through her narrow window while feeling her youth and vitality slowly drain away. The religious atmosphere within many castles added another layer of psychological oppression. Castle chapels, with their grim depictions of hell and damnation, served as constant reminders of mortality and divine judgment. The frequent religious services, while intended to provide comfort, often focused on themes of suffering, sacrifice, and the brevity of earthly life. For inhabitants already struggling with the psychological burdens of castle life, these religious messages could deepen feelings of despair and hopelessness. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of what medieval chroniclers called stone sickness, a gradual deterioration of mental faculties that seemed to affect long-term castle inhabitants. Symptoms included memory loss, difficulty concentrating, sudden violent outbursts, and a peculiar condition where sufferers claimed they could hear the stones themselves whispering. Modern historians have theorized that this condition may have been caused by a combination of factors including poor air quality, lead poisoning from pipes and vessels, vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, and the chronic stress of fortress life. The very architecture of medieval castles seemed designed to break the human spirit. Narrow, twisting staircases that left climbers dizzy and disoriented. Corridors that led nowhere, creating a maze-like confusion. Chambers with impossibly high ceilings that made human occupants feel insignificant and powerless. Every element of castle design, while serving defensive purposes, also served to remind inhabitants of their vulnerability and mortality. Seasonal depression took on new depths of meaning within castle walls. As autumn gave way to winter, the already limited natural light dwindled to almost nothing. The thick stone walls, which retained cold as effectively as they retained heat, created internal temperatures that remained uncomfortably frigid regardless of the number of fires lit. Inhabitants reported feeling as though they were slowly freezing from the inside out, their very souls growing cold along with their bodies. The psychological impact extended beyond the castle walls themselves. Families and communities that depended on these fortresses lived in constant anxiety about the mental state of their lords and ladies. A psychologically unstable castle lord could make life or death decisions that affected hundreds or thousands of people. There are numerous historical accounts of castle lords who, driven mad by the stresses of fortress life, made increasingly erratic and dangerous decisions that ultimately led to the destruction of their domains and the death of their people. Even the supposed safety and security provided by castle walls came with a psychological cost. The knowledge that one's survival depended entirely on the strength of stone and mortar created a profound sense of vulnerability. Inhabitants lived with the constant awareness that their protection was ultimately illusory, that given enough time, determination, and resources, any castle could be breached. This knowledge created a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that colored every aspect of daily life. The cumulative effect of all these psychological pressures was devastating. Medieval records are filled with accounts of castle inhabitants who simply gave up the will to live, wasting away despite having adequate food and shelter. Others turned to alcohol or other substances to numb their psychological pain, only to find that these temporary escapes made their situations worse. Still others became obsessed with death, spending their days composing elaborate funeral plans or building increasingly elaborate tombs. As we reach the conclusion of our examination of why medieval castles were death traps, we must acknowledge that these massive stone fortresses killed not only through obvious physical dangers, but also through the slow, insidious destruction of human psychological well-being. They were monuments to humanity's ingenuity in creating structures that could withstand siege engines and armies, yet they were also testaments to our species' remarkable ability to create environments that were hostile to our own flourishing. The medieval castle stands as a stark reminder that survival and living are not the same thing. While these fortresses may have kept their inhabitants alive in the narrow sense of preventing immediate death from enemy action, they simultaneously created conditions that made truly living, with joy, freedom, and psychological health, nearly impossible. In their single-minded focus on military effectiveness, Medieval castle builders created structures that were as much prisons as they were protections, death traps that killed the spirit even as they preserved the body. In understanding these psychological dimensions of castle life, we gain a deeper appreciation for the true cost of medieval warfare and the heavy price paid by those who lived within these stone monuments to human conflict. The medieval castle was indeed a death trap, but perhaps its most insidious quality was its ability to trap not just the body, but the very essence of what makes us human. Looking at the existing script content, which has covered the deadly nature of medieval castles comprehensively across 10 parts, here's part 11, continuing the narrative. As winter descended upon the medieval landscape, the deadly nature of castles reached its most perilous peak. The very season that should have provided shelter and protection transformed these stone fortresses into frozen monuments to human suffering. When snow began to fall and ice formed on the battlements, the castle's numerous hazards multiplied exponentially, creating a perfect storm of danger that claimed more lives during the dark months than any siege ever could. The first and most immediate threat came from the castle's heating systems, or rather, the catastrophic lack thereof. Medieval castles were notoriously impossible to heat effectively. The massive stone walls that provided protection from enemies also acted as enormous heat sinks, absorbing what little warmth could be generated and radiating it uselessly into the winter air. Great halls that might accommodate hundreds during summer feasts became Arctic chambers, where breath froze in the air and wine turned to slush in goblets. The central hearths, while impressive in scale, were woefully inadequate for heating such vast spaces. These enormous fireplaces consumed tremendous quantities of wood, but heated only the immediate area around them. Beyond a radius of perhaps 10 feet, the temperature dropped precipitously, creating dangerous thermal gradients that could cause rapid onset hypothermia in anyone who ventured too far from the flames. Servants and guards who had to move throughout the castle faced constant exposure to life-threatening cold, their extremities going numb and their core body temperatures dropping to dangerous levels. The smoke from these massive fires created its own deadly hazards. Without proper ventilation systems, thick clouds of acrid smoke would fill the halls, especially when wind conditions were unfavorable. The smoke carried deadly carbon monoxide, an invisible killer that would silently poison inhabitants. Many castle dwellers died in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning, their bodies discovered only when servants came to wake them in the morning. The combination of insufficient oxygen and toxic fumes created an atmosphere that was literally poisonous to breathe. Water systems, already problematic during warmer months, became death traps in winter. Wells would freeze solid, cutting off the primary water supply and forcing inhabitants to rely on stored water that quickly became contaminated. The lack of fresh water led to increased consumption of ale and wine, which, while safer than stagnant water, led to widespread alcoholism and impaired judgment that resulted in countless accidents and poor decisions. Even more dangerous were the attempts to obtain water from frozen sources. Desperate inhabitants would venture onto frozen moats or attempt to break ice from wells, often falling through and drowning in the frigid water below. The weight of armor and heavy winter clothing made escape from such situations virtually impossible. Bodies would often remain trapped under ice until spring thaw revealed the grisly extent of winter's toll. The castle's sanitation systems, primitive at best during normal conditions, became completely non-functional in winter. Guardrobe chutes would freeze, creating massive blockages that caused human waste to back up into the living quarters. The stench became overwhelming, but more dangerous was the spread of disease through the contaminated environment. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses ran rampant through the close quarters, killing inhabitants who had survived the initial cold. Food storage and preparation became matters of life and death during winter months. The castle's food stores, while impressive in quantity, were often inadequately preserved for extended cold periods. Root cellars would freeze, destroying stored vegetables and leaving inhabitants without essential nutrients. Scurvy became common as fresh produce disappeared entirely, causing teeth to fall out, wounds to fail to heal, and eventually death from internal bleeding. The process of cooking itself became incredibly hazardous. Kitchen fires, essential for food preparation and warmth, were constantly at risk of spreading out of control. The combination of desperate attempts to generate heat and the abundance of dried materials created tinderbox conditions. Many castles were partially or completely destroyed by fires that started in kitchens during winter months, trapping inhabitants in blazing stone chambers with no means of escape. Perhaps most insidious was the way winter darkness affected the psychological state of castle inhabitants. The long nights and short grey days created a crushing sense of isolation and despair. Seasonal depression, while not understood in medieval times, was a very real phenomenon that led to increased rates of suicide, violence, and reckless behaviour. The confined spaces and constant proximity to others in distress created a pressure cooker environment where minor disputes could explode into deadly conflicts. The castle's defensive features became particularly treacherous in winter conditions. Icy battlements and frozen walkways turned routine patrols into death-defying endeavours. Guards attempting to maintain watch would slip on ice-covered stones, plummeting to their deaths in the courtyards below. The narrow spiral staircases, already dangerous in normal conditions, became virtual death traps when covered with frost and ice. Many inhabitants died from falls down these treacherous passages, their bodies broken on the stone steps below. Arrow loops and murder holes, designed to provide defensive advantages, became channels for deadly winter winds that created hurricane-force drafts throughout the castle. These bitter winds would extinguish torches and candles, plunging areas into complete darkness while simultaneously dropping temperatures to lethal levels. The constant exposure to these bone-chilling drafts led to frostbite, pneumonia, and eventual death for many castle dwellers. The structural integrity of castles was severely compromised by winter conditions. The freeze-thaw cycle would force water into tiny cracks in the masonry, then expand as it froze, gradually splitting stones and weakening walls. This process, repeated over many winter cycles, led to sudden collapses of walls, roofs, and entire sections of castles. Inhabitants had no warning when centuries-old stones finally gave way, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. Storage areas became particularly dangerous during winter months. Grain stores, essential for survival, were often located in the coldest parts of the castle to prevent spoilage. However, these areas became so cold that spending any extended time in them could be fatal. Servants sent to retrieve supplies would sometimes be found frozen to death among the grain sacks, their bodies preserved by the very cold that was meant to protect the food. The psychological toll of winter confinement cannot be overstated. Castle inhabitants, already dealing with the stress of potential warfare and daily survival, found themselves trapped for months in increasingly desperate conditions. The combination of cold, hunger, disease, and isolation drove many to madness. Historical records speak of inhabitants who simply walked out into blizzards, preferring a quick death by freezing to the slow agony of winter castle life. Medical care, primitive under the best of circumstances, became virtually non-existent during winter months. Herbs and medicines would freeze and lose their potency, while the castle's physician, if there was one, was often among the first casualties of winter diseases. Without proper medical intervention, minor injuries became infected and gangrenous in the cold, damp conditions, leading to amputations or death. The daily routines that sustained castle life during warmer months became impossible to maintain in winter. Religious services, essential for maintaining morale, were often cancelled due to the impossibility of heating the chapel. The lack of spiritual comfort compounded the physical misery, leaving inhabitants without the psychological support they needed to endure the harsh conditions. Even the most basic human needs became sources of danger. Using a garderobe in winter conditions was not only uncomfortable, but potentially fatal, as the extreme cold could cause immediate hypothermia. Many chose to use chamber pots instead, but the accumulation of human waste in living quarters created unsanitary conditions that bred disease and death. The castle's livestock, essential for food and materials, suffered tremendously during winter months. Animals would freeze to death in their stalls, depriving inhabitants of fresh meat, milk, and eggs. The death of horses was particularly catastrophic, as it eliminated any possibility of escape or communication with the outside world. Dead animals would often remain frozen in place until spring, creating additional health hazards as they eventually thawed and decomposed. Water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning had to be melted from snow and ice, a process that required constant fires and tremendous amounts of fuel. The competition for wood became so fierce that furniture, doors, and even structural elements were sometimes burned for warmth, further compromising the castle's integrity and livability. The isolation imposed by winter weather meant that any serious emergency became a death sentence for the entire castle population. If supplies ran low, if disease broke out, or if structural damage occurred, there was no possibility of outside assistance until spring. Many castles that were thriving communities in autumn were discovered in spring to contain nothing but frozen corpses, mute testimony to winter's deadly embrace. The irony was profound and tragic. These massive stone fortresses, built at enormous cost and effort to protect their inhabitants from human enemies, became elaborate tombs during the very season when protection was most needed. The same thick walls that could withstand siege engines became prison walls that trapped inhabitants with cold, hunger, and disease. The same height that provided strategic advantage became a guarantee that any fall would be fatal. As spring finally arrived and the ice began to melt, the full horror of winter's toll would be revealed. Bodies would emerge from snowdrifts in courtyards. Wells would yield up the frozen corpses of those who had fallen through ice, and the castle's population would often be reduced by half or more. The survivors, weakened by months of privation and trauma, would face the enormous task of disposing of the dead and attempting to rebuild their shattered community. Medieval castles, these monuments to human ambition and engineering skill, were ultimately revealed as elaborate death traps that turned the natural cycle of seasons into an annual holocaust. The very features that made them impressive as defensive structures made them uninhabitable as human dwellings. Winter after winter, these stone fortresses claimed the lives of those they were meant to protect, proving that sometimes the greatest enemy was not an invading army, but the simple, relentless advance of winter itself. Looking at your medieval castle script summary and the reference materials, I'll create part 12 that serves as a compelling conclusion to your series. Here's the script. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of these medieval fortresses wasn't the immediate dangers they posed, but how they fundamentally warped the human psyche of those trapped within their walls. Castle life created a peculiar form of madness that historians have only recently begun to understand. A slow, creeping insanity born from the intersection of isolation, paranoia, and absolute power. Consider the psychological profile of a typical castle lord. Here was a man who lived in constant fear of assassination, revolt, or siege. Every meal could be his last, poisoned by a disgruntled cook. Every servant might be a spy for his enemies. The very walls that protected him also imprisoned him in a world of perpetual suspicion. Sleep became elusive when every shadow might conceal a dagger. Every footstep in the corridor could herald his doom. The isolation was perhaps worse than the fear. Castle lords often went months without seeing anyone outside their immediate household. They were cut off from the rhythms of normal life, from the simple pleasures of walking freely through a village or having an unguarded conversation with a stranger. This isolation bred a particular kind of narcissism and detachment from reality. Many lords began to see themselves as gods among mortals, their judgment infallible, their desires paramount. We see evidence of this psychological deterioration in the increasingly bizarre behaviors documented in castle records. Lords who demanded their food be tested by multiple tasters before each bite. Nobles who slept in different rooms each night, following no pattern that enemies could predict. Castle rulers who became convinced that birds were spying on them, ordering the systematic slaughter of every raven and crow within miles of their fortress. The servants and guards fared no better psychologically, living under constant surveillance, knowing that any mistake could result in brutal punishment or death. They developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. Many castle servants reported chronic insomnia, unable to sleep for fear of making a noise that might disturb their lord. Others became obsessively focused on minute details of their duties, checking and rechecking their work dozens of times. The children born in these environments suffered perhaps the most tragic psychological damage. Growing up surrounded by violence, paranoia, and death created adults who were fundamentally unable to trust or form healthy relationships. Many noble children were raised primarily by wet nurses and tutors, seeing their parents only during formal occasions. They learned early that affection was weakness, that trust was dangerous, and that power was the only thing that mattered. Castle chroniclers recorded disturbing accounts of noble children who tortured animals for entertainment, who showed no emotion when witnessing executions, who spoke casually of murder and betrayal as if discussing the weather. These weren't inherently evil children. They were products of an environment so toxic that it poisoned their developing minds. The seasonal patterns of castle life only amplified these psychological pressures. Winter months were particularly brutal, with everyone trapped together in close quarters for months at a time. The combination of limited daylight, poor nutrition, and cabin fever created explosive tensions. Castle records show that incidents of violence, both among servants and nobles, spiked dramatically during the winter months. Spring brought its own psychological challenges. After months of confinement, the sudden expansion of possibilities, travel, warfare, hunting, often triggered manic episodes in castle inhabitants. Lords would embark on reckless military campaigns or grandiose building projects, driven by a desperate need to assert control over a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The religious atmosphere of medieval castles added another layer of psychological torment. Chapel services were mandatory, often multiple times per day. The constant emphasis on sin, damnation, and divine judgment created a pervasive atmosphere of guilt and fear. Many castle inhabitants developed what we would now recognize as religious obsessive-compulsive disorder, performing elaborate rituals to ward off divine punishment. Castle confessors held enormous psychological power over inhabitants. These priests knew everyone's secrets, fears, and guilty thoughts. They could absolve or condemn with a word, and many used this power to manipulate castle politics. The knowledge that your deepest thoughts were being reported to both God and potentially your enemies created an additional layer of psychological stress. The economic pressures of maintaining a castle also took a severe psychological toll. Lords lived in constant fear of bankruptcy, knowing that financial ruin could mean the loss of everything: power, status, family, life itself. The enormous costs of maintaining walls, feeding armies, and projecting power meant that even wealthy nobles lived on the edge of financial disaster. This economic anxiety manifested in increasingly desperate behaviors. Lords would mortgage their children's futures, sell family heirlooms, or embark on risky ventures in pursuit of quick wealth. The psychological stress of these financial pressures often led to poor decision-making, creating a downward spiral of debt and desperation. The gender dynamics within castles created additional psychological trauma, particularly for women. Noble women lived under constant surveillance, their value measured primarily by their ability to produce male heirs. The knowledge that failure to bear sons could result in divorce, exile, or worse, created chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of their lives. Many noble women developed what castle physicians described as melancholy, what we would now recognize as severe depression. Trapped in loveless marriages, separated from their families, unable to make meaningful choices about their own lives. These women often retreated into fantasy worlds or religious obsession as coping mechanisms. The servants who witnessed these psychological breakdowns often suffered secondary trauma. They watched their lords and ladies descend into madness, knowing that any attempt to help or intervene could be interpreted as insolence or treason. This created a culture of willful blindness, where obvious mental illness was ignored until it manifested in violence. The accumulated psychological damage within castle walls created a toxic environment that poisoned everyone it touched. Servants who managed to escape castle life often struggled to adapt to normal society. They remained hypervigilant, unable to relax, expecting violence or betrayal at any moment. Many former castle inhabitants never learned to form healthy relationships or trust others. The children of castle servants faced their own unique psychological challenges. They grew up witnessing extreme inequality, seeing how the accident of birth determined whether someone lived in luxury or squalor. This often created either deep resentment and revolutionary tendencies, or conversely, an acceptance of inequality so complete that they never questioned their own subjugation. Perhaps most tragically, the psychological damage inflicted by castle life was passed down through generations. Noble families developed patterns of dysfunction that persisted for centuries, cycles of violence, paranoia, and emotional detachment that shaped entire bloodlines. The very structures designed to preserve family power often destroyed the families themselves. The training of young knights within castle walls created its own form of psychological damage. Boys as young as 7 were sent away from their families to serve as pages, beginning a process of deliberate dehumanization designed to create perfect warriors. They were taught to suppress all emotion except anger, to view violence as the solution to every problem, and to measure their worth solely through their ability to kill. This knightly education created men who were superb fighters, but utterly incapable of functioning in peaceful society. Many knights struggled with what we would now recognize as PTSD, having witnessed and participated in horrific violence from childhood. The romantic image of chivalrous knights masks the reality that these were often deeply damaged individuals, psychologically scarred by their training and experiences. The constant presence of death within castle walls created a peculiar form of desensitization that affected everyone. Public executions were entertainment, torture was routine, and casual violence was so common that inhabitants became numb to suffering. This emotional deadening was both a survival mechanism and a tragedy, creating people who had lost touch with their basic humanity. Castle inhabitants developed elaborate superstitions and rituals as psychological coping mechanisms. They wore amulets to ward off poison, performed complex ceremonies before eating, and created intricate systems of signs and portents to try to predict and control their dangerous environment. These behaviors provided the illusion of control in a world where death could strike at any moment. The architectural features of castles themselves contributed to psychological deterioration. The narrow windows, thick walls, and maze-like corridors created a sense of entrapment that affected inhabitants' mental state. Many castle dwellers reported feeling increasingly claustrophobic over time, developing an almost pathological need to escape their stone prisons. The echo chambers created by stone walls and vaulted ceilings amplified every sound, making privacy impossible and creating constant acoustic stress. Inhabitants learned to whisper or developed elaborate systems of silent communication. But the psychological pressure of never being able to speak freely took its toll. As we reach the end of our journey through these medieval death traps, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The castles that dominated the medieval landscape were not just physically dangerous, they were engines of psychological destruction that damaged everyone who lived within their walls. They created cycles of violence, paranoia, and dysfunction that rippled outward through society, shaping the medieval world's fundamental character. The legacy of these stone fortresses extends far beyond their military function. They represent humanity's capacity to create environments so toxic that they poison the very people they were designed to protect. In our modern world, as we build new forms of isolation and control, perhaps we should remember the lessons of these medieval death traps. That walls built to keep danger out often trap something far worse within. The next time you visit a medieval castle, admire its engineering and imagine its history. But remember too the human cost of these magnificent monuments to power and paranoia. Behind every stone lies a story of suffering. Behind every tower a tale of lives cut short not by enemy action, but by the very fortress that promised safety. These were not homes. They were elaborate tombs for the living, beautiful prisons that trapped their inhabitants in cycles of fear, violence, and madness that lasted for centuries. In the end, medieval castles achieved their purpose perfectly. They were indeed impregnable fortresses. But what they kept out was not just enemies, but humanity itself, creating stone monuments to mankind's eternal struggle between the need for security and the cost of freedom. And in that struggle, perhaps, lies a lesson for us all.